The year was 1985, and Coca-Cola had a problem. They had slowly but steadily been losing market share in the beverage space for a number of years, and the studies even showed that consumers preferred the taste of Pepsi, their sworn enemy, to that of Coke. Feeling that they were losing their position at the mountaintop of the soda business, they made a hasty decision that drew immediate and long-lasting pushback from both loyal customers and the general public by retiring the Coca-Cola recipe that had for generations made them the most recognizable beverage in the world, in favor of a new recipe that sought to more closely emulate the sweeter flavor of Pepsi. While New Coke had its defenders and may have in the long run been a beneficial gambit for Coca-Cola, the experiment was cut short just 77 days after it first hit shelves, and to this day remains one of the most memorable and infamous examples of consumer backlash in American history. Following the end of World War II, Coca-Cola held a whopping 60% of the market share for cola, a subcategory of soft drinks which was popularized by Coke and which became so successful it is now nearly synonymous with sodas of all kinds. Over the next 40 years, this chokehold on the market began to loosen, in large part due to the rise of Pepsi as a direct competitor to Coke and other kinds of soft drinks carving out their own place in the market. It was believed that older consumers would seek out diet soda options, while younger consumers, who were the primary target for Coke at this point, preferred Pepsi at an ever-increasing rate, which in conjunction with cola sales being down across the nation, meant that Coke's decline was likely to worsen until something was done to stop or slow it. It was at this inflection point of the 1980s that production on a new kind of Coke began. Codenamed Project Kansas, the new soda outperformed both Pepsi and the original Coke recipe in blind taste tests, giving hope to the higher-ups at Coca-Cola that they could reverse their fortunes. The seemingly infallible new soda only became more appealing as a solution to their problems once it was also discovered that positive reactions to it became even more positive when taste testers found out it was a Coca-Cola product they were drinking, which speaks to the brand loyalty they received from their customers and is also a contributing factor to New Coke's eventual failure. Even as early on as the taste testing phase, there were those who were vehemently against the idea of New Coke and its role in replacing the original Coke recipe that they had grown up with and become accustomed to in adulthood, although this was dismissed and the plans for its eventual nationwide introduction continued unimpeded. There were those within the company who were worried about abandoning the current recipe altogether, but it was ultimately decided that too many different kinds of Coke could even further dilute their market share and give Pepsi a lead in their ongoing war from which they may never recover. With this in mind, production of Coke as it had existed for decades was set to be halted, and production of New Coke began, with it being released nationwide on April 23, 1985, nearly 100 years after Coca-Cola was first concocted. Following a press conference to announce the new recipe's introduction, Coca-Cola stocks saw an immediate increase. The surveys showed the majority of the public was aware of the impending change, a major success for Coca-Cola, at least in terms of publicity and public awareness. As expected with any change as significant as this, sales were up from the same time last year, an increase that did little to foretell what its more long-term presence on the market would be. Surveys following its public launch showed that regular Coke drinkers were buying New Coke at comparable levels to the prior recipe, that the majority liked the new recipe, if not more than the old one, then at least enough to continue buying it, and around 75% of those surveyed said they would buy New Coke again. All of that data would suggest a largely successful launch of New Coke, yet it doesn't tell the full story, as those surveys both neglected to involve members of the public who weren't regular Coke drinkers, a key demographic that New Coke had to appeal to in order to begin undoing Coca-Cola's fall from dominance, as well as customers from the southern states, where Coke had been created and where it remains to this day a source of national and regional pride for many. The southern states and their habitual Coke drinkers didn't take the New Coke nearly as well as other states did, with a multitude of reasons contributing to their animosity towards the change, but the bottom line being that it was not well received and consumers in the South were desperate for Coke to return to what they knew it as. This sentiment was not confined to the southern states, as New Coke had its detractors all across the nation, but it was most concentrated there and had much more meaningful potential consequences for Coca-Cola, as many of Coke's most loyal and previously unwavering customers were from that region. New Coke was under fire from all sides, whether it be news articles and talk shows, letters and phone calls directed towards Coca-Cola headquarters, or even a class action lawsuit filed with the intention of getting Coca-Cola to revert to the old formula or to at least sell it to someone else so that it wasn't completely lost. Even under all this duress, however, New Coke continued to sell well. And although all the negative publicity from New Coke's critics wasn't ideal, people were talking about Coke again in a way that they simply hadn't been in the years leading up to New Coke's release. both due to the highly negative response from the southern states and worry that New Coke wouldn't resonate with consumers in international markets. Internal discussions began to be had about reintroducing Original Coke to the product line, with pressure mounting from the public, Coke's bottlers, and those within the company who felt that the New Coke experiment had been a failure. The decision was made in early July for production of the original recipe to be resumed, and on July 11th, 1985, a mere 2.5 months since the initial press conference announcing New Coke, another conference was held, this time announcing that Original Coke would be returning. While this decision ultimately doomed New Coke, it was not phased out immediately, and instead suffered a long and drawn-out death, being rebranded as Coke 2 in 1990, before finally being discontinued in 2002. The legacy of New Coke is much more complicated and nuanced than that of a seemingly colossal failure should be. In the months following New Coke's release and the subsequent return of Original Coke to the American market, sales of Coke vastly outpaced those of Pepsi. And by the end of 1985, Original Coke was outperforming both Pepsi and New Coke by a significant amount. It is undeniable that although New Coke itself may not have been the smashing success that Coca-Cola needed to revitalize themselves, it served as perhaps the primary catalyst for that revitalization. Not only due to the prolonged media circus and publicity that typified its time as the flagship product of Coca-Cola, but also due to the way that it allowed Coca-Cola to differentiate itself from Pepsi to consumers. By making as public of a mistake as they had, and then reversing course so quickly, it portrayed Coca-Cola as a brand that listened to consumer feedback and that was willing to defer their business decisions to the public they're supposed to be creating their products for. In the ongoing soda wars between Coke and Pepsi, this then helped cultivate the image of Coca-Cola as a company focused less on their margins than customer satisfaction, a kind of publicity that Pepsi never received due to them largely staying the course throughout their existence, and which certainly remained a part of the public consciousness for at least long enough to make a degree of difference in the post-New Coke era. This has led to a number of conspiracy theories arising about the introduction of New Coke and the near immediate reversion to the original formula, with the most common theory being that the boost in sales that Coca-Cola saw following the return of Original Coke was planned out in advance, and that New Coke was destined to fail in order to incite public outrage and the eventual bump in sales that occurred following Original Coke's reintroduction. Although it would be near impossible to either prove or disprove this theory, the fact remains that while New Coke itself wasn't the success Coca-Cola was hoping for, it brought about some of the most successful years they had seen in decades, and in doing so, helped set the stage for Coke to remain the preeminent soda of both the US and the world.